Hi, this is the video version of my Active Directory home project. For the web version with only text and images, I have included a link in the description below. So before I get into how I set everything up, here's just a quick overview of the entire project. I set up two virtual machines in VirtualBox. On one of them, I installed Windows Server and Active Directory, promoted it to domain controller, and set up network address translation and routing, as well as a DHCP server. The second machine was a client running Windows 10, and I set its network adapter to internal only, so in order to get internet access, it would have to connect through the domain controller and get an IP address assigned to it by the DHCP server. Once routing and DHCP was all set up, I created a few sample accounts in Active Directory, both admins and normal users. I put them in different organizational units and security groups, created and enforced group policy objects, mapped shared drives and created home folders for our sample users, and enabled both remote desktop connections as well as remote assistance. And that is the overview of the entire project. So now I'll get into how I set everything up. In VirtualBox, I named my domain controller DC and set up the virtual machine to have two network adapters. One led out to the internet while the other one led inwards to the local network. After Windows Server was done installing, I went into the network adapter settings and labeled them internal and external accordingly. I also set a static IP on the internal adapter. Then I installed Active Directory and promoted the VM to domain controller. I created a new forest called domain.com, and after it restarted a few times, I added the network address translation and routing feature in Server Manager. While all of this was going on, I had Windows 10 installing on my other virtual machine, which I named Win10. As mentioned earlier, I only had one network adapter on this VM, which connected to the internal network only, so it would go through the domain controller to access the internet. At this point, I had yet to set up the DHCP server, so in order to test the internet connection, I had to manually set the IP of the client in order to connect to the domain controller. And everything was working as intended. Now I went ahead and added the DHCP role over on the server. Once it finished installing, I configured a scope, and back on the Windows 10 machine, I changed the network adapter settings back to the defaults so it would try and obtain an IP address automatically, and I was still able to access the internet. To check that everything was working as intended, I opened the DHCP manager on my DC and saw that my Win10 machine was given a lease that fell within the scope that I had set, confirming that DHCP was functioning as intended. Now that the internet was working, I joined my Windows 10 workstation to the domain. Before doing that, however, I created a few sample accounts in Active Directory users and computers. First, I added some new organizational units, one for domain admins and one for a fictional sales department. Then I created an admin account in the former and a couple of regular user accounts in the latter. On the Windows 10 machine, I joined the computer to my domain using the login credentials from the admin account that I'd just created. And to double-check everything, I logged out of the local user account on the Win10 machine and logged back in using new Active Directory credentials. Even though my network has only 2 machines, I decided to install RSAT tools on the Windows 10 client just to test things out so that I could modify Active Directory, group policy, and other features directly from the client. And once RSAT tools were installed, I was able to modify Active Directory directly from the client while I was logged in as an admin, but a regular user was only able to view the settings but not make any changes. Back on the domain controller, I made some changes to group policy. First, I altered the default settings across the entire domain so that if any user failed to log in 5 times, it would automatically lock their account. Next, I created a new group policy object to apply specifically to the sales OU that I'd created earlier. This object would prevent the specified users from shutting down the computer while still logged in, and it would also prevent them from accessing the task manager. Once I located those specific options and enabled them, I linked my new object to the sales OU and then enforced it. Back on the Windows 10 machine, once I logged in as a regular sales department user, I saw that indeed the shutdown feature and the task manager were off limits. However, when I elevated to admin privilege, I was able to still get into the task manager, so it appeared that the group policy had updated by itself. Now, it was time to create shared folders and map the shared drives to our new users in the sales department. To achieve that end, I created 2 new security groups named Sales and Personal. Then I created file shares with corresponding names. And for some reason, this time I wasn't able to create shares directly in Server Manager. Last time I did this, there was a shares feature here, but this time it wasn't there, so I went into Computer Management and created my shared folders there, Sales and Personal. Then, in File Explorer, I added the permissions of both folders to allow their corresponding security groups to modify the contents of these folders. Back on the Windows 10 VM, I was logged in as a sales user, and here I mapped the network drive so that it would show up in this user's File Explorer. And to set up their home folder, I went back to Active Directory users and computers over on the other machine and created a subdirectory within the personal share with the same name as the user. And back on the client machine, when I opened up File Explorer, it navigated directly to the folder which I had just created within the personal share. Then I repeated the same steps for the other user in the sales OU. I set up his home folder in ADUC, and then I mapped the shared folder on the workstation. Up next, I enabled remote access so that people could use the remote desktop connection feature to log in to the Windows 10 machine from elsewhere. For the purpose of this home lab, I would be remoting in from the domain controller itself. Since my actual PC has limited RAM, I'm only able to run 2 virtual machines at the same time. So over on the Windows 10 client, I enabled remote desktop, and I adjusted the firewall settings to allow inbound network connections. Here I got the IP address of the client, and moving back to the domain controller, I was able to successfully remote into the Windows 10 machine. The last thing I did for this Active Directory home project was to set up remote assistance to allow someone on the Windows 10 device to invite a trusted user to assist them remotely and share desktops. And this feature proved to be trickier than expected to set up, and I ended up having to combine everything I'd done so far in order to get remote assistance to work. On the domain controller, I installed the remote assistance feature in Server Manager. Once the installation was complete, I created a new organizational unit in Active Directory users and computers and named it Workstations. Then I moved all my workstations, which is just the one right now, into the new OU. I noticed that the default computer folder in ADUC does not show up in Group Policy Manager, but when I move all the machines into the new Workstations OU, they do show up, allowing me to link objects to the whole folder. Next, I created a security group called Allow Remote Assist, and this would be an access control list of people who would be allowed to accept remote assist invitations into the designated workstations. For now, I just added the domain admins to the security group just to keep things simple. Back over in Group Policy Manager, I created a new object and named it Allow Remote Assist. Then I navigated to the feature named Configure Offer Remote Assistance, and I enabled it. And here I added the security group that I just created, Allow Remote Access, and linked it to the Workstations OU. So everyone in the security group, namely domain admins, would be able to use the remote assistance feature. So to test everything out, on the domain controller I was logged in as an admin, while on the Windows 10 machine I was logged in as a normal user. And here I opened up remote assistance and saved the invitation file on the desktop. And for home lab purposes, I also saved the password on the desktop. And back on the domain controller, I used the $$ feature to remotely access the desktop of the user on the Windows 10 device. Here I found both the invitation file, as well as the code that I had saved in the text file earlier. Using these, I was able to screen share with that user, creating a simulated remote assistance session. And here I requested control, and indeed I was able to modify and alter the desktop of the user from the domain controller directly. And that concludes this home lab. That's it.